Imagine this. You're standing on a dusty battlefield, the sun beating down mercilessly as thousands of warriors clash in a symphony of steel and screams. Suddenly, from across the field, you see something that makes your blood run cold. A wall of shields moves toward you like a giant metallic turtle, arrows bouncing off it harmlessly. Behind it, ranks of disciplined soldiers advance in perfect formation, their red cloaks billowing like harbingers of doom. This isn't just any army. This is the Roman war machine, and you're about to witness why they conquered half the known world. Welcome back to Ancient Rome Revisited. I'm your host, Marcus Aurelius, and in today's video, we're going to break down the most devastating battle tactics that turned Roman farmers into the ancient equivalent of Terminators. We'll explore how formations like the legendary testudo turned soldiers into living tanks, how the triple line system worked like a military conveyor belt of death, and how Roman commanders played chess while their enemies were still figuring out checkers. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why saying, "When in Rome," meant you were probably about to get conquered by the fiercest fighting force the ancient world ever saw. Before we begin, though, if you love ancient Roman history, then click the subscribe button now, and you'll never miss another episode of Ancient Rome Revisited. If you've just clicked subscribe, then I, Marcus Aurelius, thank you. Now let's crack into the most famous tactical maneuver in the Roman army, the testudo, Rome's version of the tank. Let's start with the most iconic Roman formation, the testudo, or tortoise. Imagine if a group of people decided to cosplay as an armored vehicle, and you've got the basic idea. Here's how it worked. The soldiers in the front row would hold their shields straight out, creating a wall. The men on the sides would angle their shields outward, and here's the genius part. Every soldier behind the front row would hold their shield above their head, creating an overlapping roof of protection. From above, it looked exactly like a tortoise shell, hence the name. This formation was basically the ancient equivalent of a tank, but made entirely of very angry Romans. Arrows, spears, even boiling oil would just bounce off or flow around the sides. The soldiers could advance steadily under this mobile fortress, and when they reached the enemy, they'd break formation and unleash hell. One of the most famous examples of the testudo in action was during the conquest of Britain. Roman legions used this formation to approach Celtic hill forts, completely immune to the rain of arrows and stones the defenders hurled at them. The Celts must have felt like they were trying to stop a steamroller with pebbles. The triple line, Rome's military conveyor belt. Now let's talk about the triple line system. Think of it as the ancient version of having 3 teams of fresh players ready to tag in during a basketball game, except instead of basketball, it was brutal warfare. The Roman legion was arranged in 3 distinct lines. First up were the hastati. These were the younger soldiers, kind of like the eager rookies who think they're invincible. They wore lighter armor and carried javelins. Behind them stood the principes, the seasoned veterans in their prime, heavily armored and ready for serious business. Finally at the back were the triarii, the grizzled old-timers who'd seen it all and were kept in reserve for when things got really desperate. Here's where it gets brilliant. When the hastati got tired or started taking heavy casualties, they'd fall back through gaps in the princeps' line, who would then step forward fresh and ready to fight. If the princeps started struggling, the triarii would advance. It was like having a subscription service for fresh troops. Just when the enemy thought they were winning, boom, here come the reserves. This system was so effective that there's a famous Roman saying, "It has come to the triarii," which basically meant, things are really serious now. It's like saying, "We're bringing in the big guns." Except the big guns were middle-aged Romans with decades of combat experience and serious anger management issues. The wedge, ancient armor-piercing rounds. The wedge formation was Rome's answer to breaking through enemy lines, and it worked exactly like you'd expect from the name. Picture a human arrowhead made of shields and swords, designed to punch through enemy formations like a hot knife through butter. The strongest, most experienced soldiers would form the point of the wedge, with additional ranks spread out behind them in a triangular formation. The idea was simple, but devastatingly effective. Concentrate all your force at one point, smash through the enemy line, and then spread out like a deadly flood once you'd created a breach. Think of it like a medieval battering ram, but instead of hitting a door, you're hitting a wall of very confused enemies who suddenly find themselves surrounded by Romans coming at them from all angles. Once the wedge penetrated the enemy formation, it would split their army in two, allowing other Roman units to attack the now isolated enemy groups. The wedge was particularly effective against undisciplined barbarian armies who relied on sheer numbers rather than tactical coordination. While they were busy trying to figure out what was happening, the Romans had already carved through their center and were busy making their day significantly worse. The quincunx, Rome's deadly checkerboard. The quincunx formation gets its name from the Roman coin that had 5 dots arranged like the 5 on a dice, 1 in each corner and 1 in the center. This staggered checkerboard pattern was pure tactical genius, and here's why. Instead of arranging their troops in solid lines like most armies, the Romans would position their units in a staggered pattern with gaps between each unit. This might sound counterintuitive. Why leave gaps that the enemy can exploit? But that's exactly what made it so effective. When enemy forces tried to charge through these gaps, they'd find themselves channeled into kill zones where Romans could attack them from 3 sides. It was like a deadly maze, where every wrong turn led to a sword in the face. Plus, the units in the second line could provide cover and support for the front line, or quickly move to reinforce any position that was under pressure. The quincunx was particularly effective against cavalry charges. Horses, being somewhat smarter than their riders, really didn't like charging into what looked like a solid wall of sharp, pointy things. The gaps would tempt cavalry to charge through, only to find themselves trapped in a Roman sandwich with extra stabbing. Flanking maneuvers, the art of the sucker punch. Roman commanders understood something that modern football coaches also know. Sometimes the best way to win is to go around the sides rather than straight through the middle. Flanking maneuvers were Rome's specialty, and they elevated the sucker punch to an art form. The basic idea was simple. While your main force kept the enemy busy in the center, you'd send cavalry or mobile infantry units around the sides to attack the enemy's flanks or rear. It's like getting into an argument with someone while their friend sneaks up behind them, except with more armor and significantly more stabbing. One of the most famous examples of Roman flanking was at the Battle of Cannae. Ironically, this was when Hannibal used Roman tactics against them, but it shows how effective the strategy was. The Romans were so confident in their flanking abilities that they walked right into Hannibal's trap. It's like being so good at chess that you don't notice your opponent is playing 4D chess. When Romans did flanking right, it was absolutely devastating. Enemy armies would suddenly find themselves attacked from multiple directions. Their formations would collapse, and what started as an organized battle would turn into a very one-sided game of tag. Attrition warfare. Death by 1,000 cuts. The Romans didn't always go for the quick knockout punch. Sometimes they preferred to slowly grind their enemies down through attrition warfare. Think of it as death by 1,000 paper cuts, except the paper cuts were made by professional soldiers with very sharp swords. Roman armies were incredibly well supplied and disciplined. They could maintain long campaigns, siege cities for months, and keep fighting when other armies would have given up and gone home. Their superior armor, training, and logistics meant they could outlast almost any enemy in a prolonged conflict. This was psychological warfare as much as physical. Nothing breaks an army's morale, quite like realizing that no matter how many Romans they kill, more just keep coming. It's like playing a video game where the enemy has infinite respawns, and you only get one life. The Romans would often deliberately draw out conflicts, wearing down enemy supplies, morale, and manpower, while keeping their own forces fresh and well-fed. By the time they moved in for the final assault, they were fighting a demoralized, exhausted enemy who was already half defeated. Fortification. Rome's real estate empire. Roman engineering wasn't just about roads and aqueducts. They were absolute masters of military fortification. Every night, Roman armies would build fortified camps that were basically temporary cities, complete with walls, ditches, and organized streets. This wasn't just about defense, it was about projecting power and psychological dominance. Imagine being a barbarian warrior and seeing Romans show up, defeat your army, and then casually build a small fortress overnight, like it's no big deal. It's like someone beating you at chess and then building a castle on the board just to rub it in. These fortifications served multiple purposes. They provided safe bases for operations, protected supply lines, and demonstrated Roman engineering superiority. When enemies saw Romans building permanent-looking structures, they knew these weren't raiders who would leave after grabbing some loot. These were conquerors who were planning to stay. The psychological impact was enormous. Roman fortifications said, "We're not just visiting. We're your new neighbors, and we're here to stay." Siege warfare. When knocking politely doesn't work. When Romans encountered a fortified city, they didn't just shrug and go home. They brought out the ancient equivalent of power tools. Roman siege warfare was a masterclass in medieval engineering and persistent violence. They had catapults that could hurl stones the size of small cars, ballistas that fired giant arrows like ancient sniper rifles, and siege towers that let them literally bring the fight to the enemy's doorstep. But the real genius was in their methodology. Romans approached sieges like engineering problems that needed to be solved. They'd build ramps, dig tunnels, construct elaborate siege works, and basically turn the area around an enemy city into a massive construction project dedicated to breaking down walls. It was like having a very violent and well-armed construction crew show up at your house. The siege of Masada is a perfect example. The Romans built a massive ramp up the side of a cliff just to reach the fortress. That's the kind of "we're not giving up" attitude that made Rome an empire. Pre-battle maneuvers, the psychology of war. Roman commanders understood that battles were won before the first sword was drawn. They were masters of psychological warfare, and they knew that a demoralized enemy was half defeated before the fighting even started. Romans would carefully choose their battlefields, positioning themselves on high ground or in terrain that favored their tactics. They'd time their attacks for maximum psychological impact, often appearing at dawn like armored harbingers of doom. They'd even use their reputation as a weapon. By the time Rome was at its peak, just hearing that Roman legions were approaching was enough to make some enemies surrender. The Romans also understood the importance of intelligence gathering. They'd send scouts, bribe local informants, and study their enemies' tactics and weaknesses. It's like having a cheat code for warfare. By the time the battle started, Romans often knew exactly what their enemies were going to do. Conclusion: the Roman war machine. So there you have it, the tactical innovations that turned Rome from a small Italian city-state into the master of the ancient world. These weren't just military strategies, they were a complete system of warfare that combined discipline, engineering, psychology, and brutal efficiency. The Romans succeeded because they treated warfare like a science. While their enemies relied on individual courage and traditional tactics, Romans constantly innovated, adapted, and improved their methods. They were like the ancient world's version of a tech company, always updating their software. But in this case, the software was designed to conquer civilizations. These tactics worked so well that they influenced military strategy for centuries. Modern armies still study Roman formations, and many of the principles they developed are still used today. The next time you see a military formation or hear about combined arms tactics, remember that Romans were perfecting these concepts over 2,000 years ago. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Roman military tactics, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. I've got tons more ancient warfare content coming your way. And let me know in the comments, which Roman tactic do you think was the most effective? Would you rather face a testudo formation or find yourself on the wrong end of a wedge charge? Until next time, remember, when in Rome, try not to get conquered. Thanks for watching.